America's lost mansions, Gilded Age palaces blown up, burned, or abandoned. Imagine this. Once, along the bluffs over the Hudson, near the shores of Newport and deep in quiet forests, there stood real stone castles. 100 rooms, marble staircases, gold-trimmed halls, private theaters, and winter gardens. These were the palaces of the richest people in America. And today, almost no one knows that most of them simply disappeared. Some of these mansions were blown up with dynamite. Others burned in fires so huge they could be seen for miles. Some were just left behind, with pianos, paintings, and crystal chandeliers left to rot in the rain. The official reasons sound simple: taxes, repairs too expensive, new roads. But behind each palace, there is a strange story: explosions in the night, mysterious accidental fires, sudden decisions to bulldoze a masterpiece down to the foundations. Why did America destroy its own palaces? Was it only about money? Or did the country want to erase the traces of an age of extreme wealth on purpose? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1: How to Demolish an American Versailles. The morning arrives cold and gray. Spring 1980, White Marsh Hall, outside Philadelphia. A crowd gathers behind chain-link fencing. They stand in near silence. Some hold cameras ready, others simply stare. They are watching the end of something that once looked like it would last forever. The house in front of them is enormous. More than 100 rooms, French limestone walls, carved stonework that took craftsmen years to complete. Details you expect on European palaces. A scale you associate with royalty. But this is not Europe. And this is not a royal residence. It is a private home. Or it was. Now it is about to be destroyed. The demolition crew moves with practiced precision. Explosives sit at key structural points. The house has been empty for decades. Windows shattered. Roof sagging and torn. Yet the skeleton remains powerful. Stone does not surrender easily. Someone gives a signal. The charges detonate. For a heartbeat, the building seems to hold its breath. Then gravity takes control. Walls buckle. The roof folds inward. Dust surges into the air, a thick, rolling cloud that briefly swallows the sun. When it thins, the scene looks like a war zone. Rubble, fragments. Stone once cut to order and laid with care, now scattered across ground that will soon be grated flat. A woman in the crowd wipes her eyes. A man beside her shakes his head. A few teenagers on bicycles watch without grasping what they are seeing. To them, it is just an old structure coming down. They do not know the history. They do not know what it cost to build. They do not know about the parties, the famous guests, the orchestras. The gardens planned by landscape architects who also worked for kings. Within weeks, the rubble will be hauled away. The land will be cleared. Suburban houses will rise. Neat lawns, driveways, basketball hoops, ordinary American life. And White Marsh Hall will turn into a ghost. Not the kind of ghost that rattles chains or wanders hallways. The kind that disappears. The kind that leaves almost no trace except in old photographs and in the fading memories of people who once walked past its walls and wondered what went on inside. This is the story of how that happened. Not only to White Marsh Hall, but to dozens of houses like it. Mansions so grand they rivaled anything in Europe. Built by families whose names were synonymous with American industry. Designed by the best architects money could buy. Filled with art, rare books, imported furniture, and every object that wealth could acquire. And then, one by one, they vanished. Some were demolished on purpose. Others burned in fires that were never fully explained. A few were simply abandoned, left to rot until the county condemned them, and bulldozers finished the job. The official explanations always sounded practical. Too expensive to maintain, too big for modern life, land too valuable to devote to a single house. But the sheer scale of the destruction raises harder questions. Why did America, a country that celebrates historic preservation in theory, allow so many of its grandest houses to disappear? Why did families who spent fortunes building these palaces let them slide into ruin? And why, in some cases, did the destruction unfold so quickly it felt almost intentional? To understand what happened to these houses, you have to understand the world that built them. The Gilded Age, the age of railroads and steel. A time when a single generation accumulated fortunes on a scale America had never seen before. An era when building a palace did not seem like madness. It was proof that you had arrived. But you also have to understand what came after. New taxes, 2 world wars, shifting social values, the rise of suburbia. The moment when keeping a 100-room mansion no longer made sense. This is the story of that rise and that fall. Chapter 2. Why build a palace? The Gilded Age mentality. The houses did not appear by accident. They were the physical result of very specific economic forces that collided in the decades after the Civil War and pushed wealth into the same few hands with unusual speed. Between 1865 and 1900, American industry reshaped itself. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel production multiplied again and again. Telegraph lines linked cities that had previously felt like separate worlds. Banking networks grew sophisticated enough to move capital across state lines in hours instead of weeks. Fortunes piled up faster than almost anyone had imagined. A man who started with a small iron forge could, within 20 years, control steel production along half the eastern seaboard. A banker who financed one railroad line could end up backing dozens. A merchant who once imported fabric could turn that business into a retail empire. The speed mattered. These were not old money families with inherited titles and centuries of accumulated estates. They were men who liked to think of themselves as self-made. At least that was the story they told about themselves. The reality was messier, but the script stayed the same. I built this from nothing. And if you believed you had built an empire from nothing, you needed a castle to show the world it was real. The European model was right in front of them. Great fortunes demanded display. Not only for vanity, though ego was definitely part of it. Display functioned as social infrastructure. It broadcast your rank. It pulled the right people into your orbit. It made alliances, business deals, and marriages possible. A man with a modest brownstone might be rich, but a man with a 60-room mansion and formal gardens was clearly a power. So they built, not practical houses, not even especially comfortable houses by modern standards. They built declarations in stone and marble. Consider the logic. You are a railroad executive. Your rival has just finished a house with 30 rooms and a ballroom. If you put up a house with 20 rooms, you look smaller. If you build a house with 40 rooms and 2 ballrooms, you look dominant. The arithmetic is brutal and simple. More rooms, more land, more visible luxury, more status. And status mattered in ways that are easy to underestimate. This was a society in motion. The old East Coast families still held cultural authority, but their financial strength was slipping. The new industrial barons had money, but they needed recognition. A grand house became a shortcut to legitimacy. It said, without words, I belong at the top table. The houses also had clear, practical uses. They were stages. A man could not host a dinner for 50 important guests in a narrow townhouse. He needed width. He needed rooms designed for entertaining, with circulation and acoustics planned in advance. He needed staff to run kitchens, lighting, music, transport. The mansion was not just a residence, it was a machine for creating and preserving influence. The competition played out in public. On Fifth Avenue in New York, mansions lined up like a row of carved stone trophies, each one trying to overshadow the next. One family laid entire halls in Italian marble. The next imported full interiors from French chateaux. Another commissioned custom-stained glass from Tiffany that turned sunlight into a private light show. On Long Island's North Shore, later nicknamed the Gold Coast, the pattern repeated on a larger canvas. Here there was room to spread out. Estates sprawled across dozens of acres. Some had their own farms, their own power plants, even their own fire brigades. Houses sat on ridgelines or directly above the water. Approaches were choreographed. Long, curving driveways, heavy gates, and vistas carefully arranged so that every arrival felt like entering a separate world. Newport followed its own code. The summer cottages. They were anything but modest. They were built for only a few months of use each year, but those months carried enormous weight. Newport was where reputations were made or broken, where marriages were negotiated, where fortunes were measured and quietly ranked. Outside Philadelphia, the main line turned into another corridor of palaces. The railroad suddenly made commuting realistic. Wealthy families planted country estates within easy reach of downtown offices. Land was cheaper than in Manhattan, the air cleaner, the parcels wider. Here they could claim both, the pulse of urban business and the theater of rural grandeur. The scale kept expanding because the system allowed it. There were no federal income taxes yet. Labor was cheap and abundant. Materials could be ordered from almost anywhere. If you wanted a particular limestone from France, you shipped it. If you wanted artisans who specialized in gilded plaster ceilings, you brought them from Italy and housed them on site for months or even years. The result was a landscape of ambition turned into architecture. Houses that announced, in stone and copper and glass, that their owners had conquered something. Railroads, steel, banking, trade. Whatever the source of the fortune, the house was the physical proof. Yet even while the chandeliers sparkled and the orchestras played waltzes in marble halls, the foundations of that world were less secure than they appeared. The wealth was real. The power was real. But both depended on economic rules and social assumptions that would not hold forever. The world that made these palaces possible was already beginning to shift, quietly, beneath their footings. Chapter 3. Gold Coast and Millionaire's Row, where wealth lived. The palaces were not scattered randomly across America. They clustered in specific zones, places where proximity to other wealthy families mattered, where being seen in the right location was part of the point. Fifth Avenue in Manhattan was the most visible stage. The stretch between 51st and 96th Streets became known as Millionaire's Row. Vanderbilts, Astors, Carnegies. Their houses lined the avenue like a physical ledger of American wealth. Each facade fought for attention. Each entrance announced the family's taste, ambition, and resources. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace occupied an entire block at 51st Street. 3 connected houses, one for William Henry Vanderbilt, one for each of his daughters. French Renaissance style, high ceilings. Art galleries that opened to the public on certain days. The message was clear and deliberate. This family did not just have money, they claimed culture. A few blocks north, the Astor Mansion sprawled across another prime corner. Then came dozens of others. Some families built in pale limestone. Others preferred warm red brick. A few went all in on full chateau style, with turrets and carved stonework that looked as if it had been lifted straight from the Loire Valley. The competition never really stopped. One family commissioned stained glass windows from John Lafarge. Another hired Stanford White to design their ballroom. A third imported entire wood-paneled rooms from English manor houses and rebuilt them piece by piece in New York. But Fifth Avenue had limits. Land was brutally expensive. Lots were narrow. You could build upward, but you could not spread outward. You could not create the kind of grounds real European estates had. Gardens were postage stamp small. Privacy was thin. Your neighbors were literally on the other side of the wall. Long Island's North Shore offered the solution. The Gold Coast, as it came to be called, offered space. Families bought hundreds of acres. They built houses on hilltops with sweeping views over Long Island Sound. They created self-contained worlds. Gates kept outsiders away. Long driveways created a sense of approach and arrival. Formal gardens, drawn up by landscape architects trained in Europe, stretched toward horizons, planned like stage sets. The houses here were even larger than their Manhattan counterparts. 60 rooms, 80 rooms, 100 rooms. Why not? There was space, there was money, and as always, there was competition. F. Scott Fitzgerald would later set The Great Gatsby here. The fictional West Egg and East Egg rested on real geography, real houses, real parties, where hundreds of guests arrived by car and by boat and orchestras played until dawn. The novel was not fantasy. If anything, it softened the scale. Harbor Hill, built for Clarence Mackay, sat on roughly 650 acres. The house alone covered ground equal to several city blocks. Formal gardens radiated in every direction. There were greenhouses, stables, a working dairy farm, and staff housing that looked better than most people's actual homes. When Charles Lindbergh returned from his transatlantic flight in 1927, the reception was held at Harbor Hill. That is the level we are talking about, a house where national heroes were welcomed. Where newspaper headlines turned into real events in real rooms. Newport, Rhode Island, followed slightly different rules, but obeyed the same logic. The cottages there were summer houses. Families arrived for the season, June through September. But nothing about the buildings themselves was modest. The Breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had around 70 rooms. Marble Hall, the main entrance, was designed to overwhelm. Ceilings 50 feet high, columns imported from Italy, gilded details on almost every surface. Visitors were meant to feel small, impressed, and very aware they were stepping into a different world. Rosecliff, Marble House, The Elms. Each property had its own personality, but they all served the same core purpose: display, entertainment, and social dominance. The parties became legend. Costume balls with hundreds of guests, dinners with long sequences of courses, each paired with different wines. Orchestras brought in from Europe for a single night. Decorations that took weeks to install and would be dismantled before morning. One hostess reportedly had her ballroom filled with live butterflies. Another turned an indoor space into a garden with real trees and a working fountain. The extravagance was not merely tolerated, it was expected. Back on the mainland, the main line outside Philadelphia developed its own palace culture. Families with names like Stotesbury, Widener, and Cassatt built country estates within commuting distance of the city. The Pennsylvania Railroad made the arrangement practical. You could live in a 100-room mansion and still reach your office in under an hour. These houses had everything the city palaces lacked: space, privacy, cleaner air. And they had everything the isolated rural estates lacked: proximity to other wealthy families, plus easy access to urban culture, politics, and business. The geography of wealth was carefully engineered. Each zone served a different strategic purpose. Manhattan was for visibility and public status. Long Island was for sheer grandeur. Newport was for summer society and ritualized display. Philadelphia's main line was for year-round comfort wrapped in rural scale. But geography alone could not keep these houses alive. Stone and marble were only the outer shell. They depended on something else, something more fragile than masonry, and far harder to maintain than gardens. They required a continued, uninterrupted flow of money. Chapter 4. Case 1. Harbor Hill, the house above the clouds. Harbor Hill was not just large, it was a piece of strategy carved into stone. Clarence Mackay chose the site with care, the highest point on Long Island's North Shore. Roughly 650 acres of rolling land with clear views over Long Island Sound. On some mornings, when fog settled into the valleys below, the house seemed to float above the clouds. That image mattered to Mackay. His father had made the fortune: telegraph lines, transatlantic cables, the hidden infrastructure that stitched continents together. Clarence inherited the money and the pressure that came with it. He had to prove he belonged at the top, that he was not just living off another man's achievement. Harbor Hill was his answer. Construction began in 1899. The architect was Stanford White, the man wealthy families called when they wanted something people would still be talking about decades later. He designed the Washington Square Arch, the old Madison Square Garden, and dozens of mansions for America's richest families. For Mackay, White created a house that borrowed the language of French chateau, but pushed the scale into something distinctly American. The building sprawled. Reportedly around 120 rooms. The exact count depended on where you drew the line. Did you include storage rooms, servant quarters, the basement wine cellar that could hold thousands of bottles? The approach was staged like a performance. Visitors came through gates that looked as if they had been lifted from a European estate. The driveway wound upward through shaped landscape. Trees were planted to frame specific views and hide others. The ascent by car took several minutes. By the time you reached the main entrance, you understood the point. You were entering somewhere important. The entrance hall set the tone, 2 stories high. A grand staircase splitting into 2 sweeping arms. Carved stone details that kept craftsmen on site for months. Materials arrived from all over. Marble from Italy, wood paneling from England, custom fixtures from New York workshops. The public rooms were built for entertaining on a scale most people could not picture. The ballroom could hold hundreds of guests. The dining room seated 50 comfortably. More if chairs were added. There were multiple drawing rooms, each with its own mood. A library with shelves running from floor to ceiling. A music room with acoustics tuned by specialists, so an orchestra could fill the space without deafening anyone. Behind the scenes, the service infrastructure was vast and mostly invisible. Kitchens large enough to prepare food for 200 people. Pantries, cold rooms, staff quarters for dozens of workers. Heating systems that required their own building. Private electrical generators because the public grid was too unreliable for a house like this. Outside, the estate continued the performance. Formal gardens stepped down the hillside in measured terraces, reflecting pools and fountains, broke up long lines of stone. Sculptures imported from Europe punctuated the views. A greenhouse complex grew exotic plants all year, even through Long Island winters. Mackay used Harbor Hill exactly as planned. He entertained business partners, politicians, visiting aristocrats, and foreign dignitaries. The house was his calling card, his proof that he belonged in the same breath as older American dynasties. The most famous moment came in 1927. Charles Lindbergh had just completed his solo flight across the Atlantic. New York needed a place to celebrate him. The official reception was held at Harbor Hill. Thousands came. Lindbergh stood on the terrace, looking out over the same view that had convinced Mackay to build there. Photographs from that day show the house at its peak, crowded, illuminated, woven into the national story. But even then, fault lines were already visible. Mackay's fortune, while enormous, was not bottomless. The house cost far more to run than he had expected. Staff wages, coal for heating, constant repairs, taxes. The annual operating budget reached into six figures every single year, whether he filled the rooms with guests or not. His marriage collapsed. His wife left Harbor Hill. A house designed for grand entertaining felt hollow, with one person moving through its corridors. He tried to keep it going. He could not imagine giving up the place that had become his public identity, but the numbers kept grinding him down. After his death in 1938, the family had to choose: keep the house and watch it eat what remained of the fortune, or cut their losses and walk away. They walked away. Harbor Hill sat empty for years. During the Second World War, the military looked at the property as a possible facility and decided even the government did not want to carry that maintenance bill. That decision alone said a lot. In 1947, demolition crews arrived. The house that had taken years to design and build disappeared in a matter of months. Dynamite brought down the main structure. Wrecking balls reduced what was left. Stone was crushed and used as fill. Some architectural fragments were salvaged and sold. A fountain ended up in a public park in another state. Bits of carved stone surfaced in other buildings. The house scattered into unrecognizable pieces. The land was carved up and sold. Suburban houses rose where terraces and lawns had once been. Small lots, single-family homes. The kind of ordinary American neighborhood Harbor Hill had been built to tower over. Today, almost nothing is left. A few stone gateposts, a stretch of wall. Most people who drive through the area have no idea what stood there. They do not know about Lindbergh's reception, the balls, or the view that made Clarence Mackay feel as if he had built a house above the clouds. The highest point on Long Island is still there, but the palace that crowned it has vanished. Chapter 5, Case 2, Whitemarsh Hall, building in American Versailles Harbor Hill, slipped out of existence almost quietly. Whitemarsh Hall's exit was anything but quiet. Edward Stotesbury made his fortune late. He was already in his 60s when he married Eva Cromwell in 1912. She was younger, fiercely ambitious, and she had a very clear picture of what their shared life should look like. She wanted a palace, not just a big house, not even a grand estate. A palace, a residence that would announce unmistakably that they had arrived in the highest ranks of American society. A place that would make other wealthy families stop, look twice, and adjust their own plans upward. Stotesbury had the means. He was a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, one of the most powerful banking houses in the United States. His personal fortune was estimated in the tens of millions. In 1916, that kind of money could bend reality. It could build almost anything you could sketch on paper. They chose land outside Philadelphia, in Whitemarsh Valley, rolling hills, good drainage, clear air. Close enough to the city for business and social obligations, far enough for privacy and control. Roughly 300 acres to work with. Their architect was Horace Trumbauer. He had already built for the Wideners, the Elkinses, and other Philadelphia dynasties chasing European grandeur at American scale. For Whitemarsh Hall, he designed a house that leaned heavily on French and English precedents, but pushed past both in sheer size and ambition. The house would have 147 rooms. The precise count depended on how you classified certain spaces, but the number itself became part of the myth. More rooms than the White House, more interior volume than many luxury hotels. Construction stretched over years. Stone was quarried specifically for the project and cut to order. Skilled craftsmen were brought in from Europe to handle the most delicate work. Inside, the house demanded gilded plaster, hand-painted ceilings, marble from Italy, rich wood paneling from England. Every surface was decided in advance. Very little was off the shelf or standard. The entrance hall rose through multiple floors. A grand staircase dominated the space, splitting into broad arms as it climbed. Guests ascending could look down at the patterned marble below and up at painted ceilings above. The entire composition was meant to do one thing: overwhelm. The public rooms pushed that feeling even further. The ballroom could hold hundreds of people. The dining room seated 40 guests comfortably, with hidden staff corridors tucked behind wood panels so servants could move in and out without breaking the flow of conversation. There was a private theater with proper seating, an art gallery, a library where rare books were displayed almost like museum exhibits, and multiple drawing rooms, each decorated in its own carefully chosen style. The service areas were just as vast, only out of sight: industrial-scale kitchens, dedicated storage rooms for china, silver, and crystal, deep wine cellars, staff quarters for the army of workers needed to keep a place like this running, laundry facilities big enough to deal with constant linens and uniforms, a heating plant that looked less like part of a home and more like a compact factory. Outdoors, the same level of intention continued. The gardens were drawn up by top landscape architects, formal parterres in the French tradition, reflecting pools, fountains with classical figures, terraces stepping down in careful, measured levels, a greenhouse complex for year-round flowers and exotic plants, stables for horses, and garages for the growing fleet of automobiles. The price tag matched the vision. Estimates differ, but construction alone likely passed $3 million in 1916 money, the modern equivalent of well over $80 million. And that was only the shell. Furnishing the house required another wave of spending. Art, furniture, tapestries, decorative objects. Everything was chosen with one goal: to impress people who were already hard to impress. Eva Stotesbury got her palace, and for a time, she used it exactly as intended. The parties at Whitemarsh Hall became local legend. Orchestras played in the ballroom while hundreds of guests moved across the floor. Dinners ran through multiple courses, prepared by European-trained chefs. The long driveway clogged with automobiles as Philadelphia's elite arrived in evening dress. Inside, staff flowed through the corridors like a small, disciplined army, keeping the illusion effortless. For a brief window, the system worked. The Stotesburys sat at the center of Philadelphia society. Their house became the address everyone wanted on an invitation. The scale, the luxury, the obsessive polish of every detail, all of it achieved its purpose. But even at the height of the glamour, the costs were brutal. The house required a permanent staff of dozens: groundskeepers, housekeepers, cooks, chauffeurs, security personnel, each one drawing a salary, each one needing housing, food, uniforms, and management. The heating bill alone was enormous: 147 rooms, many with very high ceilings, in a region with real winters. The coal needed to keep Whitemarsh Hall warm was measured in tons per week, not bags per month. Property taxes climbed as local officials recognized just how valuable the estate was on paper. Maintenance never stopped. A building that big is always breaking somewhere: roofs to patch, plumbing to repair, electrical systems to upgrade as technology changed, stone weathering outside, wood swelling and shrinking inside. Every problem came with a large invoice attached. The Stotesburys could cover it, but just. Their wealth was large, not infinite. Edward was aging. He had already been an older man when they started this project. Now he was simply old. So a question hung over Whitemarsh Hall, even while orchestras played and chandeliers spilled light over the marble. What happens when the money slows down? The answer would arrive sooner than anyone there expected. Chapter 6. The bill comes. Due, maintenance, taxes, and new times. Edward Stotesbury died in 1938. Eva was left with Whitemarsh Hall and a fortune that turned out to be smaller than everyone had assumed. The Great Depression had arrived in the narrow window between the house's peak years and Stotesbury's death. Even the richest families did not get through it untouched. Investments sank. Dividends that had seemed as steady as gravity suddenly stopped. The banking world that had made Stotesbury rich was shaken all the way down to its foundations. Eva tried to keep the machine running. She cut staff. She closed off unused wings. She trimmed entertaining to the bare minimum. But there was a limit to what you could save by tightening belts in a palace. The arithmetic was merciless. A house with 147 rooms had to be heated whether those rooms were full of guests or sitting empty and dark. The boilers did not care if there was a party or a widow living alone. They devoured coal. Someone had to shovel it. Someone had to service the pumps and valves. That person expected a paycheck. Property taxes were tied to what the assessors said the land and buildings were worth. Whitemarsh Hall sat on roughly 300 acres of prime ground, with a palace-sized structure on top. The annual tax bill ran into the tens of thousands of dollars every single year. Whether the house produced a cent of income or not, maintenance never stopped. Roofs began to leak. Stone on the facades cracked and weathered. Old plumbing corroded. Early electrical systems needed upgrades. None of this could be handed to a random handyman. You could not let an inexperienced worker experiment on gilded plaster, custom wood paneling, or imported marble. The specialists who knew how to repair those materials charged accordingly, and past a certain point, staff costs could not be pushed any lower. You needed security to keep thieves and vandals out. You needed someone to oversee the grounds and basic systems. You needed minimal housekeeping so the building did not slide into mold and rot. Even a stripped-down crew for a house of this size meant a dozen or more people on the payroll. Eva ran the numbers. Whitemarsh Hall was eating what remained of her fortune. If nothing changed, the house would push her into bankruptcy within a few years. She was not alone at that crossroads. All over America, families who had built Gilded Age palaces were staring at the same spreadsheet. The rules of the game had changed. Income taxes, introduced in 1913, had started modestly. Over time, they climbed. The Revenue Act of 1935 pushed the top marginal rate up to 79%. Suddenly, keeping the after-tax income required to run a palace meant earning vastly more than before just to stand still. Inheritance taxes were new and heavy. When the family patriarch died, heirs often had to sell something immediately just to pay the government. Mansions like Whitemarsh Hall were assets on paper, but they did not throw off cash. They burned it. That left heirs with a brutal choice: sell income-producing assets to keep a glamorous money pit, or let the house go and keep the businesses and stocks that actually paid the bills. Labor costs were also shifting. The domestic servants who had once worked long hours for modest wages began to find better options. The Depression had been brutal, but as recovery crept in, new paths opened. Factory jobs, retail positions, office work. Jobs that did not require living under your employer's roof and being on call at all hours. At the same time, attitudes toward wealth were changing. The kind of showy excess embodied by Whitemarsh Hall started to feel awkward, even shameful. The Depression had put breadlines and shuttered factories on the front page. Flashing gold while your country was staring at hunger felt out of step. Even among the rich, there was a growing preference for lower profiles and quieter luxury. Some owners tried to improvise a new business model. They rented out their houses for events, weddings, charity balls, corporate dinners, anything that might produce revenue to offset the bills. A few properties with good locations and manageable sizes managed to survive this way as event venues. Others tried another route: donation. They offered their mansions to universities, hospitals, religious orders. On paper, it sounded like a win-win. The family shed a burden. The institution gained a grand building. But once accountants ran the numbers, many charities saw the same problem: a gift that could bankrupt the recipient. Keeping the lights on, the heat running, and the roof intact cost more than most institutions could justify. The result was often surreal. Houses that had cost millions to build could not find buyers at any price. The issue was not that no one liked them. It was that no one could afford to carry them. Eva Stotesbury held out longer than many. She tried living at Whitemarsh Hall with a minimal staff. She tried renting it. She tried to find a buyer who would take on both the house and the burden that came with it. Every attempt failed. In 1943, she finally moved out for good. The house was closed. Furniture was covered with sheets. Windows were shuttered. The staff was dismissed, leaving only a caretaker to walk the grounds and check the building from time to time. Whitemarsh Hall sat empty, year after year. The costs did not vanish. Taxes still came due. Basic maintenance and security still required money. But no one lived there. No parties. No dinner guests pulling up the long drive. Just a vast stone shell beginning quietly to decay. Other families were making the same call. Harbor Hill had been demolished in 1947. Dozens of Fifth Avenue mansions were coming down, replaced by apartment towers that generated steady rental income instead of swallowing it. In Newport, several cottages stood dark, their owners unable to sell them, unable even to give them away. The age of the American palace was ending, not with a final ball or a noble farewell, but with something much colder, an accounting sheet that no longer added up. Chapter 7, Case 3, The Mark Hopkins Mansion and the Fire that took everything. Not every palace fell to slow economics. Some met faster, more violent ends. The Mark Hopkins Mansion sat on Nob Hill in San Francisco, the city's high throne. From there you could look out over the bay and the downtown streets below. It was the address that said you had reached the absolute top of West Coast society. Mark Hopkins had made his fortune in railroads. He was one of the big four behind the Central Pacific, the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, the project that tied California to the rest of the United States and made a handful of men unimaginably rich. His mansion reflected that new railroad wealth. The house sprawled across the hilltop, rising in multiple stories of elaborate Victorian architecture, towers, bay windows, ornate carved wood. Inside, the rooms were layered with expensive materials, rare hardwoods, imported fixtures, art gathered from Europe and Asia. It cost more than $2 million to build, in money from the 1870s. At the time, it ranked among the most expensive private homes in America. Hopkins died in 1878, but his widow stayed on. For decades, the house remained a fixed point on the skyline, a landmark visible from much of the city, a daily reminder of what railroad money could buy. On the morning of April 18, 1906, that illusion of permanence ended. The earthquake hit at 5:12 in the morning, magnitude 7.9. The ground shook for nearly a full minute. Buildings cracked and collapsed across San Francisco. Yet the Hopkins Mansion, anchored into bedrock on Nob Hill, survived the first blow. The structure held. The damage was serious but not fatal. Then the fires started. Gas mains ruptured. Electrical lines sparked. Dozens of separate fires ignited almost at once. The city's water system had shattered in the quake. Mains were broken, pressure gone. Fire crews rolled out. But when they opened hydrants, almost nothing came. The flames grew and merged. Block after block went up. Wind pushed the fire front uphill toward Nob Hill. By afternoon, dark smoke was visible from the Hopkins Mansion. By evening, the fire line was crawling up the slopes. There was no realistic way to stop it, no water, no modern equipment that could reach the hilltop in time. Too many fires, too large, too fast. The Hopkins Mansion burned through the night. The wooden interiors went first, floors, paneling, staircases, furniture, everything that would catch. The heat climbed until it cracked stone and warped iron. By dawn, the mansion was a shell. Sections of stone wall still stood, but the roof had fallen in. Windows were empty black holes. Inside was only ash and twisted metal. 3 days later, when the fires finally died, Nob Hill looked like a battlefield. The Hopkins Mansion, the Crocker Mansion next door, the Flood Place, the Stanford House. All the great houses of San Francisco's aristocracy, clustered on the city's crown, had been destroyed in the same catastrophe. The immediate loss was physical, rooms full of things that told a family's story. Art, books, furniture, letters, photographs, decades of accumulation, gone in a single event. But the deeper loss was symbolic. These houses had stood for stability and control, for the idea that if you anchored your wealth in stone and iron, it would last for generations. The earthquake and fire answered that dream bluntly. Nature does not care about your status. To physics, a mansion is just another structure, and structures can burn. Some of Nob Hill's families chose to rebuild. The Flood Mansion rose again. Others took the insurance checks, sold their lots, and relocated. The social geography of the hill shifted. The Hopkins site became something entirely different. In 1926, the Mark Hopkins Hotel opened on the same ground. It is elegant and successful, but it is not a private palace. It is a piece of commercial real estate, a business designed to generate revenue and keep itself alive. That shift was not unique. Over time, the pattern repeated. When grand houses burned, the land underneath was almost always too valuable to use for another single-family mansion. Hotels made more financial sense. So did apartment towers and mixed-use developments. The neighborhood upgraded from private palaces serving one family to shared luxury, serving hundreds of guests or tenants. Officially, the San Francisco fire was a natural disaster, triggered by the quake. No one set out to destroy the Hopkins Mansion, but the outcome was exactly the same as if a demolition crew had been paid to knock it down. The structure was gone. The way of life it had embodied could not simply be rebuilt in the same form. In the decades that followed, other mansions met similar ends. Fires flared up mysteriously in empty houses. Investigators blamed faulty wiring, vagrant campfires, lightning strikes. Some cases were clear accidents. Others left behind questions that were never fully answered. Fire was thorough, in a way demolition rarely was. When you brought a house down with crews and machinery, you could salvage pieces, doors, mantles, carved stone, light fixtures, materials with resale value. Fire stripped all that away. What it left behind was nearly worthless: charred beams, cracked stone, slumped metal, scrap to be bulldozed into trucks and hauled off. Insurance payments, when policies were up to date, could be very generous. Sometimes the check from the insurance company was larger than anything the owner could have gotten by selling the property in a normal market. In a few cases, a fire solved money problems that nothing else could fix. The Mark Hopkins Mansion burned because an earthquake tore a city apart. But its story revealed something bigger. These grand houses, designed and advertised as permanent monuments, were far more fragile than their owners ever admitted. One night, one fire, and a century's worth of forever turned into ash. Chapter 8. Too much house, too few heirs. The fire on Nob Hill was spectacular, but most palace deaths were quieter, slower. They unfolded not in a single night, but over years, when the next generation simply walked away. The pattern repeated across America. A wealthy patriarch poured money into a grand house. He lived there for decades. He entertained, negotiated, and showed off the house exactly as he had intended. Then he died. And his children faced a brutal question: do we actually want this? Often, The answer was no. The reasons varied, but the outcome stayed the same. The next generation had different priorities, different careers, different ideas about what wealth should look like in everyday life. Some had grown up inside the mansion and quietly resented it. Too formal. Too many rules about which rooms were for family and which were for guests. Too much pressure to perform good manners in their own home. Their childhood had played out in a building designed to impress strangers, and as adults, they wanted something that felt like a house, not a stage set. Others had already scattered. They had married, moved to other states or other coasts, and built lives elsewhere. The old family house was just a place they visited on holidays. They had no desire to move back and take on a full-time job managing a crumbling palace. Even if they technically inherited enough money to run it, they did not want the responsibility strapped to their daily life. Some heirs had been educated in Europe and preferred staying there. To them, American mansions felt gaudy, overstuffed, and weirdly insecure. Too new, too eager to prove something. If you wanted authentic grandeur, Europe had actual castles with moats, ruins, and centuries of history baked into the stone. Why spend your adulthood maintaining what felt like an imitation on the main line or on Long Island? Even for the heirs who were emotionally willing, the practical obstacles were enormous. Running these places required a body of knowledge most people simply did not have. You needed to know which contractors could repair a slate roof the size of a football field, which specialist could patch gilded plaster without leaving a scar, which suppliers could still provide the specific coal, linens, and food the house was designed around. How to manage a staff of 20 or 30 people without chaos. How to plan dinners or dances for hundreds of guests without everything collapsing into confusion. That expertise often died with the patriarch. He had spent decades learning how to operate his palace like a machine. His children had watched from a distance, but never truly learned the controls. When the title transferred, they suddenly found themselves responsible for a giant system that looked smooth from the outside, but felt impossible to manage from within. The emotional weight was heavy as well. These houses were, above all, their parents' dreams, not theirs. Living there meant stepping into someone else's vision and wearing it every day. Some heirs felt trapped by inheritance. On paper, the house was worth millions. In reality, it was unsellable. Who would buy such a place? And if you did manage to sell it, you were the one who let the family legacy go. That sense of guilt was real and corrosive. Back at Whitemarsh Hall, all of these dynamics played out in slow motion. Eva Stotesbury had shut down the house in 1943. She died in 1946. The property passed to heirs who had no real connection to it. They had never lived there, never hosted a party under its ceilings, never fallen in love with its view. They did not want the house, and even if they had, they could not afford to keep it alive. So the mansion sat empty, year after year. The bills kept coming, but no one slept in the bedrooms. No lamps burned in the windows. No drivers rolled up the long drive. Just a massive stone shell, slowly surrendering to time and weather. Windows broke. Rain seeped in. Water stains crawled down walls. Plaster loosened and fell from ceilings in slow, silent avalanches. The idle heating system began to fail. Pipes froze every winter and burst, soaking rooms that no one saw until weeks later. Every season added new damage. The building was dying by degrees. The family tried to sell. No buyers. They tried to donate. Schools studied the operating costs and walked away. Hospitals did the same. Religious orders politely declined. Even government agencies, which sometimes grabbed large properties for offices, clinics, or training schools, passed after seeing the upkeep estimates. By then, the house had slipped into a strange category: negative value. On paper, it was impressive. In real life, taking ownership meant taking on a mountain of bills and headaches. The rational choice was to leave it alone and hope some miracle buyer appeared later. Similar scenes were playing out all over the country. On Fifth Avenue, mansions stood dark for seasons at a time, waiting for demolition because no heir wanted to live in a 60-room townhouse in Manhattan. In Newport, cottages closed at the end of one summer and never reopened because the next generation did not care about the rituals of the season. On the main line, huge estates were carved into smaller parcels because the children preferred manageable suburban houses with sensible yards and heating bills. A few families managed to find a different path. While their houses were still solid and salvageable, they transferred them to preservation groups. The properties became museums. The family surrendered ownership but secured a different form of legacy. The house would remain. Guides would lead tours. Plaques and brochures would tell the story. Great-grandchildren could visit and see where the myth of the family place had begun. That solution required foresight and cooperation. Most families did not think that far ahead. They held on until something broke. A tax crisis, a huge repair bill, a sudden drop in income. By the time they were ready to act, the building had usually decayed past the point where saving it made financial sense. The human side of these decisions almost never made it into the newspapers. What readers saw was a short notice: historic mansion to be demolished. Behind that bland line, there was usually at least one family member who had spent months wrestling with guilt, spreadsheets, and the fear of disappointing people who had died long before they were born. The widow quietly closing rooms and dismissing servants one by one. The heir standing alone in a vast ballroom, trying to imagine ever filling it again. The lawyer at the dining table, calmly explaining that the tax bill was larger than the estate's available cash. These were not cartoon villains gleefully destroying architectural treasures. They were ordinary people trying to survive inheritances that had turned into traps. And so, one by one, they did the only thing that truly made sense in their situation. They let go. Chapter 9. The developers arrive. Palaces versus parking lots. When families let go, someone else stepped in. Usually developers. Men who saw opportunity where everyone else saw a headache. The post-war years rewired the map. The 1950s brought a wave of suburban growth on a scale America had never seen before. Young families wanted houses, not apartments, not shared hallways and elevators, single-family homes with yards, driveways, barbecues, and swing sets. The demand was enormous. The old estates sat exactly where this new demand was strongest. They occupied land that had become prime suburbia, close to cities but outside the urban core, with decent roads, nearby rail lines, and established surrounding neighborhoods. And on that land sat huge parcels that could be sliced into dozens of buildable lots. The math was brutal and clear. Buy an abandoned mansion and 50 acres for a fraction of what it had cost to build. Demolish the structure. Flatten the site. Lay out streets and utilities. Subdivide into 50 lots. Either sell the lots or build houses yourself and sell those. The profit potential dwarfed anything the original owner had imagined. In that equation, the mansion itself had no value. It was a problem to solve. An obstacle between the developer and the real product. Rows of marketable houses. Harbor Hill fell into that logic in 1947. Demolition took months. The place had been engineered to endure. Thick stone walls, steel framing, quality materials, from foundation to roofline. It did not give up easily. But dynamite and wrecking balls do not care about craftsmanship. Eventually, they reduced the house to rubble. The roughly 650 acres were reborn as a suburban tract. Levitt and Sons, the firm that pioneered mass-produced housing, bought the land. They built hundreds of homes, small, affordable, standardized, perfect for returning veterans using the GI Bill. starting families, looking for a slice of stability. The contrast was almost comical. Where one family had once roamed through roughly 120 rooms, hundreds of families now lived in compact three-bedroom ranch houses. Extreme wealth converted into middle-class comfort. The landscape democratized. Whitemarsh Hall followed a similar arc, but at a slower pace. The house sat empty through the 1940s and deep into the 1950s. With no one watching closely, vandalism crept in. Local teenagers slipped through broken windows. Graffiti bloomed on walls that had once hosted Philadelphia's elite. Copper pipes vanished. Fixtures disappeared. Anything valuable and portable walked out the door. Local officials grew nervous. The property was turning into a hazard, a magnet for break-ins, bonfires, and trouble. Squatters appeared. Small fires broke out. Insurance and liability questions multiplied. By 1980, the county finally decided the situation could not continue. Demolition permits were issued. The explosion that opened this story was the final act of decades of slow decline. A house that had cost millions and taken years to assemble came down in minutes. Excavators moved in. The rubble left on trucks. The terraces and gardens were bulldozed flat. Today, the site is a quiet subdivision. Split-level houses and colonials with attached garages, small lawns, mailboxes at the curb, basketball hoops over driveways. Ordinary American life. A few residents know that something vast stood there once. Most have never heard the name Whitemarsh Hall. On Fifth Avenue, the mansions met the same logic even earlier. Manhattan real estate became too valuable to waste on single-family houses, no matter how lavish. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace was demolished in the 1920s. In its place rose commercial buildings, later an office tower. The Astor Mansion followed, then dozens more. The replacements were unapologetically practical. Apartment buildings that housed hundreds instead of one extended family, office towers that generated steady rental income, hotels that kept rooms full of paying guests. Structures that fit the economic reality of a modern city. Preservationists did push back. They argued that these houses were more than rich people's toys. They were architecture, history, cultural artifacts. Once lost, they could not truly be recreated. The builders were gone. The artisans who carved the stone, laid the plaster, blew the glass. Many of those skills had vanished or become prohibitively expensive. Sometimes those arguments landed in time. A handful of houses were rescued at the 11th hour, landmarked, and shielded by new preservation laws. But most palaces disappeared before those laws existed, or before the public cared enough to fight. From the developer's point of view, they were not villains at all. They were solving problems. People needed housing. The old estates were empty, decaying, and expensive for their owners and communities alike. Turning idle land into productive property felt like common sense. In some cases, there was even ideology involved. The post-war era sold itself as more democratic. These palaces were symbols of another age, an era of concentrated, visible wealth that clashed with the story America wanted to tell about itself. Leveling a mansion and replacing it with rows of middle-class homes could be framed as progress. The public mostly agreed. When Harbor Hill came down, there were no mass demonstrations, no human chains around the foundations. Architects and local historians expressed regret. Older residents remembered the house and shook their heads, but the broader community accepted the trade. The palace belonged to another era. That era was over. By the 1960s, the pattern was obvious. The grand estates were vanishing, not overnight, but steadily, one by one. Each demolition made the next easier to justify. In their place rose developments with names that nodded at the past while erasing it. Manor estates, chateau gardens, Millionaires' row apartments? The irony was hard to miss. The streets carried the surnames of the families whose houses had been razed to build them. The marketing brochures boasted of historic charm, but the buildings that had created that history were gone. And in most places, if you did not already know where to look, there was nothing left on the ground to prove they had ever been there at all. Chapter 10. Ruins, Teenagers, and the Haunted House. Before the developers arrived, there was an in-between time, the period after a house closed, but before anyone decided its fate. Sometimes that limbo lasted months, sometimes years, sometimes decades. During those years, the houses belonged to no one, and everyone at once. White Marsh Hall in the 1960s and 1970s was a ruin. The roof leaked in dozens of places. Rain poured through torn ceilings onto marble floors. Water pooled in corners. Mold spread in green and black patches. Plaster on upper levels softened and dropped in heavy chunks. The grand staircase, once designed to impress visiting dignitaries, grew slick with moisture, moss, and bird droppings. What had been a ceremonial ascent turned into a dangerous slope. Windows shattered. Some from storms and time, others from thrown rocks and casual vandalism. Once glass was gone, the outside world came in. Birds claimed the space. Pigeons nested in the ballroom rafters. Owls took over the higher floors. The house filled with animal noise, cooing, wings beating in the dark, the scratch of claws on what had once been polished hardwood, but the ruins were never truly empty of people. Local teenagers discovered White Marsh Hall, the way teenagers always discover abandoned places. Someone's older brother mentioned it. Someone climbed the fence on a dare. Stories circulated through nearby high schools. Before long, it was a regular destination. They came mostly after dark. They squeezed through broken windows or gaps in old doors. Flashlights and lighters cut narrow cones of light through huge, unfamiliar spaces. The scale stunned them. Rooms that seemed to stretch forever. Staircases that led to more staircases. Hallways that felt like they had no end. It was nothing like their split-level homes or brick row houses. Nothing like anything in their ordinary lives. They wrote on the walls names, dates, arrows, crude drawings, declarations of love and insults aimed at nobody. Layer after layer of graffiti covered gilded plaster that had once cost a fortune. Spray paint smeared across marble. Marker scrawls across hand-carved wood. Each wave of teenagers left its own version of "I was here" on top of the last. Some came to drink. The ruins offered privacy, away from parents, neighbors, and police. Empty rooms became makeshift party spaces. Beer cans piled up in corners. Broken bottles glittered on dusty floors. The stale smell of cigarettes and marijuana mixed with the damp scent of mold and rotting wood. Others came out of pure curiosity. They wanted to see what extreme wealth looked like up close. Wanted to stand in the shells of rooms where some of the richest people in America had once entertained. For them, the house turned history into a physical thing. You could touch it, walk through it. Try to imagine the carpets, the chandeliers, the music that were no longer there. Over time, the ruins accumulated mythology. Stories spread. People said they had seen figures in upper windows, heard footsteps or voices in empty corridors, felt sudden cold spots in particular rooms. In one version, a servant had died there. In another, a member of the family. Details shifted, but the conclusion never did. The house was haunted. The haunted house label carried a grain of truth. These buildings did feel eerie, especially at night. Huge, unlit rooms. Strange noises from a settling structure, loose shutters clattering, wind hissing through broken panes. Animal sounds echoing in unnatural ways. The sense that you were moving through a place designed for life that now held only echoes. The ghost stories did practical work too. They made the ruins more compelling. A simple abandoned mansion was interesting. A haunted palace was irresistible. The tales gave teenagers permission to be scared, to scream, to dare each other deeper into the dark. It made sneaking in feel like an adventure, not just trespassing. Parents and local authorities saw something very different. They saw a death trap. Floors rotting through from water damage. Staircases whose treads had loosened and rails had given way. Ceilings ready to drop without warning. Kids clambering around in the dark were not braving ghosts. They were flirting with serious injury. Or worse. There were accidents. Someone fell through a weakened floor into the room below. Someone else sliced themselves badly on jagged glass. Small fires flared when candles tipped over, or someone decided to burn trash inside. Each incident added pressure on owners and officials to act. Fences went up. No trespassing signs multiplied. Police patrols cruised by more often, but chain-link fences could be climbed, signs could be ignored, and no department had enough officers to watch every empty estate every night. At Harbor Hill, before Demolition, the pattern played out the same way. Teenagers sneaking in, parties amid the dust. Vandalism and broken fixtures, ghost stories traded at school on Monday mornings. The same thing happened at dozens of other abandoned estates. Linwood Hall outside Philadelphia, Idle Hour on Long Island, Bannerman Castle on the Hudson. Each one became a magnet for people drawn to ruins. Young photographers, urban explorers, thrill seekers, and bored kids looking for something that felt bigger than the mall parking lot. There is something powerful about watching wealth rot. It reverses expectations. These houses had been built to project permanence, to prove their owners stood above everyday problems like time, weather, and decay. To walk through them as they fell apart was to see that claim disproved right in front of you. Money had lost. Gravity and rain had won. For teenagers who lived in modest houses, these trips were a kind of unofficial education. They learned, in a way no classroom lecture could teach, that nothing is guaranteed to last, that fortunes evaporate, that the grand gestures of one generation can become the hazards and curiosities of the next. In their strange way, the ruins were more democratic than the working palaces had ever been. Anyone could enter. There were no invitations to check, no butlers at the door, no unspoken social rules, just an opening in a fence and a gap in a wall. But that democratic phase was always temporary. Eventually, a line was crossed, a serious injury, a lawsuit risk, a developer with money and plans. Decisions hardened. Demolition orders were signed. Contractors were hired. One night, the familiar path through the woods or across the field would end at a new barrier, fences reinforced. Security guards on duty, heavy equipment parked where teens used to sit and tell ghost stories. The ruins that had been their secret, their rite of passage, were scheduled for erasure. Some kids took final photos. Some squeezed in one last time, daring the guards. Most just watched from outside as holes were drilled, charges wired, and sirens sounded. The explosions echoed. Walls folded. The ruins that had been their hidden playground and their first lesson in impermanence collapsed into dust. Chapter 11. What remains? Gates, fountains, and empty shells. After the dust settled and the rubble was hauled away, fragments remained. Not much, but enough to puzzle anyone who came later. Drive through certain Philadelphia suburbs today, and you might pass a pair of stone gateposts on either side of an entirely ordinary residential street. Massive blocks of stone, around 8 feet tall, carved details still visible, even after decades of weather. They frame nothing special now, just asphalt and painted lines. Cars slide between them without slowing. Most drivers never even look. Those gates once marked the entrance to Whitemarsh Hall. They stood there for roughly 70 years after the house itself was gone. The developer who bought the land decided to leave them. Maybe he thought they added character. Maybe the cost of tearing them down was higher than the benefit. Whatever the reason, they stayed. A few blocks away in a small municipal park, there is a marble fountain in a classical style. The edges are worn, but the design is still clear. A metal plaque explains that it came from a historic estate. Most people reading it never realized that the estate stood less than a mile away. The fountain was salvaged during demolition and moved here. One piece of Whitemarsh Hall, still working, in a completely new setting. Similar fragments are scattered wherever the great estates once stood. On Long Island, pieces of Harbor Hill ended up spread across several states. A section of balustrade in a museum garden in Virginia. Carved stonework, set into a library in Connecticut. A fountain quietly running in a public park in New Jersey. This dispersal was not some careful preservation plan. It was salvage. When demolition crews took these houses apart, certain elements could be sold. Architectural dealers bought them. Private collectors paid for them. Institutions accepted donated pieces. The mansions were stripped and sold off in sections, like a luxury car sent to the scrapyard and parted out. Some fragments stayed close to where they started. In the subdivision that replaced Harbor Hill, several houses built in the 1950s and 1960s incorporated stone from the original mansion. A carved lintel now sits above a garage door. Low garden walls are made from foundation blocks. Steps leading to a modest front door once led up to a palace entrance. The current owners often have no idea. They bought their houses decades after construction. The stone is just stone. Solid, good-looking, nothing more. But every so often, someone starts asking questions. They notice the quality of the carving on a garden wall seems too fine for a basic post-war development. They dig around in local history. They discover that their property sits on what was once Harbor Hill's grounds, and that the stones in their steps were cut by craftsmen imported from Italy back in 1899. That discovery changes the way they see their own home. The small house suddenly has a hidden layer. They are living in the shadow of something bigger, walking the same slopes that wealthy families once walked, standing where a grand terrace or garden path used to be. Other remains are more complete. In Newport, several of the Gilded Age mansions survive because they were turned into museums early enough. The Breakers, Marble House, the Elms. Today they are open to tourists. Visitors pay admission, shuffle through in groups, and stare at rooms that once existed only for private parties and invited guests. Those preserved houses work like time capsules. They show in detail what was erased elsewhere, the scale, the craftsmanship, the obsessive attention to every ceiling, doorknob, and banister. Walking through the Breakers Marble Hall makes the loss of Whitemarsh Hall or Harbor Hill feel less abstract. You understand that the world did not just lose a big building, it lost a particular kind of human effort and artistry. Even so, the saved houses are not what they once were. They function as museums now. Ropes block off certain rooms. Climate control hums quietly in the background. Staff members in name tags lead scripted tours. The daily life that used to animate these spaces is gone. No one actually lives there. No morning routines. No staff switching on chandeliers for a dinner that night. Just visitors with cameras, trying to imagine the missing parts. The mansions that survived did so because someone intervened at exactly the right moment. Often it was a family member who saw the financial writing on the wall and handed the property to a preservation trust. Sometimes it was a local historical society that scrambled to raise money and purchase the building before a developer could sign the contract. Those rescues needed money, timing, and organization. Miss the window and the wrecking crew arrived. Lacking funds, even the best intentions failed. For every house that was saved, 5 more were lost. Empty shells present another kind of remnant. Linwood Hall, just outside Philadelphia, stood abandoned for decades but remained largely intact. The roof failed in places. Water gutted interiors. Yet the basic structure held together. Walking distance from where Whitemarsh Hall once stood, it became a glimpse into an alternate future. What Whitemarsh might have looked like if the bulldozers had never come. Linwood turned into a fixation for a certain type of person. Photographers documented its slow collapse. Historians dug through archives to reconstruct its story. Preservationists argued among themselves about whether it could or should be saved. The building embodied a hard question. At what point does preservation cross the line into fantasy? When is a structure simply too far gone? When does the money required to restore one house outweigh what society can reasonably spend on a single artifact of wealth? For years, Linwood existed in a kind of suspended sentence, too damaged to use, too important to demolish without a fight, too expensive to bring back to its original state. And yet, every year it remained standing kept a whole era visible. As long as it was there, people could drive past, point, and say, "This is what we almost erased everywhere." Chapter 12. Case 4. Linwood Hall, the mansion that refused to die. Linwood Hall's survival was never guaranteed. For decades, it felt like a building living on borrowed time. Always one bad winter, one new owner, one council vote away from demolition. The threat hung over it like a storm cloud that never quite broke. The house went up in 1897 for Peter A.B. Widener. He was a streetcar magnate. Transit systems, utilities, the kind of infrastructure that quietly printed money every day people went to work. By the time he commissioned Linwood Hall, he ranked among the richest men in the United States. The architect again was Horace Trumbauer, the same man who would later draw up Whitemarsh Hall. For Widener, he went even bigger. Linwood Hall had roughly 110 rooms, neoclassical style. A long, symmetrical facade, columns and proportions chosen to project authority and permanence. The visual language of "this will be here forever." The site was Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia, mainline territory. Close enough to downtown for business and culture, far enough out for broad lawns, tree-lined drives, and the kind of landscaped grounds a house this size demanded. Inside, Widener built a frame for something even more valuable than the architecture, his art. He was not a casual buyer. He collected seriously. Paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Raphael, sculpture, rare furniture. Linwood Hall functioned as a private museum as much as a home. Gallery walls. Carefully designed lighting. Thought given to temperature and humidity long before climate control was a common phrase. The family story intersected with one of the most famous tragedies of the age. Peter Widener's son, George, and grandson, Harry, boarded the Titanic in 1912. Both died when the ship went down. The loss shattered the family. A house built to showcase success and host celebrations turned into a place heavy with grief. Peter Widener himself died in 1915. His art collection, considered one of the finest in private hands, did not stay in Elkins Park. It eventually went to the National Gallery in Washington. The paintings that had once hung in Linwood's private galleries became part of the public's cultural memory instead of one family's backdrop. The house stayed in family hands, but never again served quite the same role. It was too large, too expensive, too tightly tied to the memory of those losses. And the Widener fortune, while still immense, faced the same pressures as other Gilded Age fortunes. Taxes rising, markets changing, the economics of palaces breaking down. By the 1940s, Linwood Hall was closed. The family moved elsewhere. Furniture was covered. Chandeliers went dark. Windows were shuttered. The familiar script had begun, but Linwood did not follow the usual final act. In 1952, the property was sold to a religious organization. They turned it into a seminary. Bedrooms became dormitories. Public rooms turned into classrooms and offices. Chapel services were held in the Grand Hall. The conversion was more practical than elegant, but it kept the building warm, occupied, and maintained. That era lasted until the 1990s. Then the religious group left. Once again, Linwood Hall stood empty. This time there was no clear plan for what came next. Roof damage allowed water to creep in. The same pattern seen at Whitemarsh Hall began to repeat. Rain infiltration, mold blossoming on walls, plaster dissolving and dropping, floors warping and buckling. Rooms that had once displayed paintings worth millions started to resemble the interiors of abandoned warehouses. Local preservationists started sounding alarms. Linwood Hall was not just a big house. It was a major work by Trumbauer, one of the purest surviving examples of a Gilded Age palace. If anything deserved saving, this did. But the obvious next questions were brutal. Saved for what? Saved by whom? Paid for how? The estate was privately owned. Buying it required serious capital. Restoring it would cost tens of millions of dollars. There was no obvious use that would ever earn that money back. The layout made it hard to convert into apartments. The square footage made it expensive to turn into offices or a hotel. Museums were already choking on maintenance costs. None rushed to take on another giant building that would demand a permanent stream of cash, so the house sat, year after year. Decay sped up. Copper was stripped from the roof by thieves. Vandals broke windows and slipped inside despite alarms and no trespassing signs. Every new leak, every stolen piece of metal, every freeze-thaw cycle made any future restoration more expensive and less likely. Photographers found their way in and started documenting what they saw. Images of Linwood Hall's interior spread online. Peeling wallpaper in rooms that had once been immaculate. Water stains creeping across ornate plaster ceilings. Pigeons roosting on balcony railings. The ballroom floor warped, scuffed, and stained. The photos hit a nerve. They were a visual argument about the fragility of wealth, all the fine materials, all the elite craftsmanship. None of it could defend against simple neglect. Water followed gravity. Mold took every damp surface. Wood swelled, split, and rotted. Stone cracked along hairline fractures each winter and widened each spring. Every cold season raised the same anxious questions among people following the story. Would this be the winter a major section of roof gave way? Would this be the year the building crossed the invisible line from savable to too far gone? And yet Linwood kept standing. Barely, but it did. The outer shell held. The Alberich was the underlying structure stayed mostly sound even as the finishes crumbled. The skeleton refused to give up. In 2012, a new owner bought the property. A businessman who publicly said he wanted to restore Linwood Hall. After so many false starts and rumors over the decades, skepticism was natural. Plenty of people had talked about saving the house. None had managed to do much more than patch a leak or board a window. This time, though, work actually began. The first steps were not glamorous: stabilization, emergency interventions to stop the slide, roof sections patched, water intrusion addressed, basic drainage improved. Security tightened enough to keep most vandals out. Only after that did slow restoration begin. Not a fairy tale makeover of every room. That would take decades and resources nobody had. Instead, targeted work, preserving key spaces, making the structure weather-tight, halting the most aggressive forms of decay, bringing the building back from the edge of collapse, rather than rewinding it instantly to 1900. Volunteers became part of the story. Local preservation groups organized work days. People who cared about architecture and history donated labor, materials, or money. Limited tours were open to the public to raise awareness and funds. Every ticket sold paid for a little more roofing, a little more masonry, one more emergency repair. The work is still ongoing. Linwood Hall is not saved in the simple, happy ending sense. It remains damaged. It still needs years of effort and millions of dollars. But it is no longer quietly dying. It refused to follow Whitemarsh Hall and Harbor Hill into oblivion. It refused to become another empty lot with a nostalgic street name. And in that refusal, it turned into something new. Living proof that these buildings do not have to vanish if enough people decide they are worth the trouble of keeping. Chapter 13. Why some mansions survived. Linwood Hall's story was exceptional because survival was exceptional. Most mansions did not make it. A small handful did. Understanding why shows what separated buildings destined for demolition from those that found a second life. Location mattered enormously. Houses in places that tourists could realistically reach had a much better chance. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina survived partly because it sat near Asheville, a city large enough to supply visitors, but small enough that a grand estate did not feel absurd or out of place. People could drive there. Hotels and restaurants already existed. Roads and rail made tourism practical. Hearst Castle in California benefited from similar geography, a dramatic coastal setting, a scenic drive. Close enough to Los Angeles and San Francisco to draw crowds, but remote enough to feel like a destination rather than just another building off the freeway. The mild California climate helped too. There was less freeze-thaw damage than the mansions facing brutal northeastern winters. Newport's mansions survived in part because they formed a cluster. A single house might have been easy to write off, but together they created a coherent historic district. Tourists did not come just to see one building. They came to see a whole lineup of Gilded Age cottages. Each house amplified the value of the others, making the economic case for preservation stronger. Timing was critical. Houses that turned into museums in the 1940s or 1950s enjoyed advantages that later efforts did not. Labor was cheaper. Restoration costs were lower. The pool of craftsmen who still understood traditional techniques had not yet vanished. Wait until the 1970s or 1980s, and the same work cost multiples more. The Breakers became a museum in 1948. The Preservation Society of Newport County took it over and opened it to the public almost immediately. The building was still in good shape. The family acted before financial pressure forced desperate moves. That early decision saved the house from the slow spiral that trapped so many others. Contrast that with families who clung to their mansions too long, hoping the real estate market would improve, hoping a wealthy buyer would appear, hoping for some miracle solution. By the time they accepted that preservation was the only realistic path, roofs had begun to fail. Systems had broken down, and restoration had shifted from challenging to almost impossible. Family cooperation was another decisive factor. When heirs fought over property, houses suffered. Legal battles froze decision-making. While lawyers argued, the building sat empty. Maintenance stopped. Roof leaks went unrepaired. Pipes burst. By the time courts finally resolved the disputes, damage was often severe and sometimes irreversible. When families agreed early to donate properties for preservation, the outcome was usually better. They surrendered ownership but secured legacy. Tax law helped. Donating a historic estate could generate substantial deductions, often better than selling at a loss or absorbing years of upkeep while the house slid downhill. Public support stepped in where private resources failed. In communities that cared about their architectural heritage, citizens organized. Local historical societies held fundraisers. Neighborhood groups pressed officials to act. Grassroots campaigns generated media coverage and small donations that added up. Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park, New York, became a National Historic Site in 1940. The federal government took ownership, paid for maintenance, and opened it to the public. Similar stories played out at other estates. Federal or state agencies stepped in when private owners could not cope, turning mansions into public assets rather than private burdens. But government rescue always required political will. Someone had to persuade legislators and taxpayers that spending public money on old mansions was legitimate. That was not an easy sell. Schools needed funding. Roads needed repair. Why should tax dollars save palaces built by the ultra-rich? The argument that eventually worked was about cultural heritage. These houses, advocates said, were not just rich people's toys. They were concentrated examples of American craftsmanship, architecture, and decorative arts, physical records of a specific economic and social era. Losing them meant erasing irreplaceable evidence of how the country had once lived and built. Adaptive reuse saved another category of mansions that could not function as pure museums. Converting grand houses into hotels, conference centers, or institutional buildings kept walls standing and roofs intact. Interiors often changed, sometimes drastically. Ballrooms became lobbies. Bedrooms turned into guest rooms or offices. But the exterior shells survived, and the overall forms remained. Several Newport mansions became private clubs. Members paid dues that covered repairs and operating costs. The houses stayed occupied, heated, cleaned, roofs patched on schedule. The club model provided continuous revenue that many museums struggled to match. Elsewhere, schools took over old estates. Private academies needed dormitories, classrooms, and administrative space. A mansion could be carved into all three. The conversion was rarely gentle. Original details were painted over, partition walls went up, gyms replaced formal gardens. But the structure itself stayed on the landscape instead of disappearing entirely. Across all these examples, the houses that survived shared certain traits. They had advocates, individuals or groups who were stubborn enough to fight for them. They had access to money. Whether from a single wealthy donor, a trust, public funds, or steady income from a new use, they had timing on their side, becoming protected before decay went too far. And they had luck. Luck meant a fire never started at the wrong time. It meant a particularly bad winter did not collapse the roof. It meant a preservation bid landed just before a developer's offer. It meant a city council vote went one way instead of the other. The Biltmore, Hearst Castle, the Breakers, Marble House, Vanderbilt Mansion. These were not necessarily the finest or most elegant Gilded Age houses ever built. They were the ones where enough factors aligned: location, timing, advocacy, money, and chance. For every estate that found that combination, there were others just as impressive that failed by a single step. Advocates who showed up too late. A fundraising campaign that fell short, a legal ruling that went the wrong way, a storm that hit 1 year too soon. The survivors are precious partly because they are rare. They are a narrow sample of what once existed everywhere. They show what America nearly erased in full. And they underline a final point. Preservation is never automatic. It does not happen because a building is beautiful, or old, or important on paper. It happens only when people decide, at the right moment, that it is worth the work and the cost. Without that decision, without that effort, even the grandest palace ends the same way, as dust, fill, and a few old photographs. Chapter 14. The Preservers, Historians, Enthusiasts, and Kids with Cameras. The mansions that survived had something else in common, beyond location, timing, and luck. They had people who refused to let them vanish quietly. These were not always professors or famous architects. Often they were ordinary obsessives. Neighbors who had grown up seeing a particular house on the horizon and could not imagine the landscape without it. Amateur photographers drawn to the mix of elegance and rot. Teenagers who had snuck into ruins and wanted the rest of the world to see what they had found. The preservation movement that eventually saved some Gilded Age houses started small and at first mostly lost. In the 1920s and 1930s, most Americans did not see old buildings as assets. The country was young and obsessed with progress. Old meant outdated. The default solution was simple: tear it down and build something modern. But a few people disagreed. They formed local historical societies. They started cataloging buildings scheduled for demolition. They gathered photographs, measured floor plans, traced family histories, and collected architectural drawings. They built archives that, at the time, felt like consolation prizes, but later became priceless. Their work was often thankless and depressing. They would petition to save a mansion and watch it come down anyway. They could not outbid developers or change tax laws. What they could do, they did. Document before destruction. Walk through every room with a camera and notebook. Record dimensions. Sketch details. Capture the way light fell across a staircase that would not exist in a year. Those records turned into a time machine for later generations. When people wanted to understand what had been lost, these files were the starting point. The images revealed levels of craftsmanship that standard construction no longer attempted. The drawings showed structural tricks modern builders had forgotten. The family stories linked these buildings to larger narratives about industry, immigration, and class. By the 1960s, attitudes began to shift. Urban renewal projects had bulldozed so many historic neighborhoods that people started asking whether progress automatically required erasing the past. In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act passed. It created, for the first time, a national framework for protecting significant buildings. Imperfect, incomplete, but something. Suddenly, grassroots preservation had legal teeth. Communities could nominate buildings for official status. They could fight demolition not just with petitions, but with designations, hearings, and lawsuits. Victories were still rare, but now there was at least a battlefield, instead of a foregone conclusion. A new generation of preservationists emerged. Younger people who saw value in Victorian and Gilded Age architecture their parents had dismissed as fussy or ugly. They liked ornament. They admired intricate ironwork, carved stone, patterned tile. They recognized the drama in buildings that embodied ambition, ego, and excess. Some of them became urban explorers before that term existed. They slipped into abandoned mansions, technically trespassing, and documented what they saw. Their photos circulated in small magazines, slideshows at community meetings, and envelopes mailed between enthusiasts. The images hit hard, peeling gold leaf on ceilings, collapsed plaster revealing wooden lath and structural beams, grand staircases leading nowhere because upper floors had rotted away. Beauty and ruin in the same frame. The photos made people care about houses they had never known existed when they were whole. Then the internet arrived, and the scale of all this changed overnight. Now anyone with a basic camera or early digital point-and-shoot could explore a decaying mansion on Sunday and post the results for the entire world by Monday. Websites dedicated to abandoned places appeared. Forums let people trade coordinates, which estates were still standing, which were fenced, which were already gone. Video followed. YouTube turned static images into moving tours. Explorers filmed themselves walking through silent ballrooms and service corridors. Viewers could feel the echo of footsteps, hear doors creak, see dust float through beams of light from broken windows. The scale of these houses stopped being an abstract number and became something you could feel through the screen. Some creators honed in specifically on Gilded Age mansions. They dug through archives, tracked down old photographs, and cut them into their videos. Then they walked through what remained and matched camera angles. Here is the same room a century later. They turned Harbor Hill, Whitemarsh Hall, and Linwood Hall from obscure footnotes into familiar names for hundreds of thousands of people. Social media poured fuel on this spark. Instagram accounts dedicated to forgotten architecture gained serious followings. Short TikTok videos about abandoned mansions went viral. 10 seconds of drone footage over a collapsing roof, a quick cut to a historic photo, a caption about the fortune that built it. Every post reached people who might never open a history book, but would absolutely watch a 30-second clip. The demographics of preservation shifted. It was no longer just older locals and lifelong historians fighting for these buildings. Teenagers and 20-somethings weighed in. They saw the mansions as aesthetic objects, story engines, content, and also as pieces of history worth more than the land underneath them. A teenager in suburban Philadelphia, bored one night, clicked on a video about America's Lost Versailles and discovered Whitemarsh Hall. He fell into the rabbit hole, found old photos, realized the estate had stood practically in his backyard. He had been riding his bike past its former entrance for years without knowing. He made his own video, shot the gateposts, the park with the salvaged fountain, the streets named after Stotesbury, interviewed older residents who remembered watching the demolition. When he uploaded it, the video pulled in tens of thousands of views. Comments flooded in from people all over the country saying the same thing. I had no idea this existed. I wish it were still there. That kind of attention mattered. It created an audience. And audiences are hard for politicians and developers to ignore. When another mansion landed on a demolition list, these online communities could mobilize. They shared petitions, emailed local officials, blew up comment sections on news stories. They did not always win. They rarely stopped demolition alone, but they forced the process into the light. Wrecking crews could no longer erase a century of history in total silence. The new preservationists did more than post and complain. Some offered hands-on help. Volunteers cleared trash from neglected properties, logged structural problems, created detailed photo surveys for architects and engineers, people with professional skills, restoration carpenters, structural engineers, conservation specialists, donated time. Others just showed up with gloves, trash bags, and stubbornness. At Linwood Hall, volunteers handled the kind of dirty, expensive work that would have devoured limited restoration budgets, hauling debris, cutting back invasive vegetation growing through walls, sweeping out rooms so contractors could actually assess damage. Not glamorous, no viral shots, but essential. In the process, preservation became more democratic. It was no longer only the realm of experts and wealthy patrons hosting fundraisers. It was kids with cameras, neighbors with memories, viewers who had never set foot in Pennsylvania but felt invested because they had followed the story online for years. They could not save everything. Most mansions were already gone, long before any of this infrastructure existed, but they could save memory. And sometimes, when timing, money, and politics lined up just right, they could save actual stone and timber too. Chapter 15. What lost palaces teach us about money and meaning. The cameras, the volunteers, the old photographs and archives, all of that did more than just preserve history. Together they forced a harder question: what actually lasts? The men who built these mansions were convinced they were buying permanence. Edward Stotesbury did not spend roughly $3 million on Whitemarsh Hall expecting it to stand for only about 60 years. He imagined centuries, generations of Stotesburys walking those halls, his name welded to something solid, visible, and impossible to ignore. Clarence Mackay put Harbor Hill on the highest point of Long Island for a reason. He wanted his house above everything else, physically and socially. The view stretched for miles. On clear days, you could see Connecticut across the Sound. The message was straightforward. I am at the top, but height did not protect the building. Wealth did not guarantee survival. In fact, the houses that cost the most and sat on the most valuable land often vanished first. They were too expensive to maintain. The acreage was too lucrative to leave tied up in a single residence. And the next generation often did not want the burden at all. The uncomfortable conclusion: money can build walls, but it cannot force the people who come after you to care about those walls. So what did last? The art collections. Peter Widener's paintings now hang in the National Gallery. Millions of visitors have seen them. His house is gone, but his Rembrandts and Vermeers are still there, hanging at eye level for anyone who walks through the museum doors. The lesson there is different from the one the mansions teach. What you give away tends to outlive what you keep locked up. Some fortunes endured because they were converted into institutions. Carnegie poured money into public libraries. Rockefeller underwrote universities and medical research. Vanderbilt's name survives in Vanderbilt University. These men built things that did more than burnish their reputations. They created structures, often organizational rather than architectural, that communities had a reason to maintain. The mansions were different. They were built to serve the families who paid for them. When those families died, dispersed, or simply lost interest, the houses no longer had a job. They were monuments to individual achievement. And society does not feel much obligation to preserve monuments that exist only to celebrate one person's success. There is a reason Mount Vernon and Monticello are carefully maintained while Whitemarsh Hall was not. Washington and Jefferson were not just wealthy men, they became foundational figures in the national story. Their houses plugged directly into American identity. Edward Stotesbury, no matter how rich, was ultimately only a banker. His house connected to his personal story. When that story stopped mattering to his descendants, it quietly stopped mattering to almost everyone else. That reality punches a hole in a lot of assumptions about legacy. Wealthy people pour time and money into things they hope will outlast them. Mansions, corporations, foundations with their names carved into the lobby. The assumption is simple. If you build something large and solid enough, it will be permanent, and your name will live as long as it does. But permanence turns out to be conditional. It depends on three things: ongoing money, ongoing interest, and ongoing belief that the thing is worth keeping. A house stands only if someone pays to fix the roof, heat the rooms, and repair the systems. A fortune lasts only if it is managed carefully across generations. A name survives only if it stays attached to something people still care about continuing. The Gilded Age mansions failed that test. They were spectacular, often beautiful, undeniable showcases of craftsmanship and engineering. But they were not necessary. Once they became financial traps instead of assets, once maintaining them cost more than anyone was willing to pay, they disappeared. And the hardest part to swallow is this: most people did not really miss them. The houses vanished, and life went on. The subdivisions built where ballrooms once stood turned out fine. Quiet streets, decent schools, middle-class comfort. The families living where grand staircases used to rise do not feel like something crucial is missing from their daily lives. Because for them, nothing is. Those mansions were precise answers to specific questions posed by specific people at a specific time. When the questions changed, the answers were no longer useful. What people eventually did miss was not the existence of yet another rich family estate, but the level of craft that died with them. The skills needed to create those houses almost disappeared. When preservationists later tried to restore the survivors, they discovered how rare and expensive it had become to find artisans who could match the original work. The knowledge had not been passed on. That loss goes beyond architecture. It marks the fading of whole ways of making things. The Gilded Age, for all its inequality and waste, produced objects designed to last centuries: furniture, fixtures, carved stone, metalwork. Modern equivalents are cheaper and easy to replace, but they are not built with the same expectation of surviving multiple generations. There is a sharp irony here. The wealthy built palaces intended to stand forever, and those palaces fell. But they built them using techniques and materials that could have lasted for centuries. The pieces that survive in isolation: a fountain in a park, a set of gateposts on a suburban street, a fragment of carved stone in a garden wall, are still solid 100 years later. The buildings vanished not because the masonry crumbled, but because people collectively decided they were no longer worth the effort. The broader lesson reaches far past stone and plaster. In the end, what you build matters less than why you build it. If the goal is purely personal, to prove your wealth, cement your status, satisfy your ego, then whatever you create will probably last only as long as your influence does, maybe a little longer if your children feel obligated to maintain the illusion. But if the purpose extends beyond you, if it serves a community, advances knowledge, or creates beauty that others can share, then what you build has a real chance of outliving you. Not a guarantee, just a chance. The mansions teach this mostly through their absence, through the empty lots where they stood, through the regular streets and neat lawns that replaced them, through the faded, unfamiliar surnames in old articles about houses that no longer exist. Nothing is truly permanent. Not wealth, not buildings, not names. What remains is whatever people choose, deliberately to remember and maintain. And those choices say more about what actually matters than any palace ever could. Chapter 16. Final sequence: Walking on Foundations. The site of White Marsh Hall today looks completely ordinary. Residential streets, houses with vinyl siding, driveways with basketball hoops, lawns that need mowing. The kind of landscape you could find in almost any American suburb built in the second half of the 20th century. Nothing on the surface hints at what was here before. No plaques, no interpretive signs. The stone gateposts that once framed the entrance survived for decades, but even those are gone now, removed when the street was widened. The last visible trace erased in the name of traffic flow, but the foundations are still there, underground, beneath grass and asphalt and deck footings. The limestone blocks that once carried 147 rooms still sit in the soil, buried, unmarked, but present. If you send a drone up over the neighborhood, a pattern starts to emerge. The streets curve in ways that feel slightly off for a standard subdivision. They echo the old property lines. Follow the route of the original drive. The modern layout is draped over the old estate like a new drawing traced on top of a faint pencil sketch. The land keeps the ghost of what came before, even when nothing obvious remains. That is true far beyond this one site. Across the country, wherever grand estates once stood, the ground remembers. Property boundaries still trace long-vanished fences. Streets bend around features that no longer exist. Trees planted a century ago still rise over ranch houses and split levels built 70 years later. On Long Island, you can still detect Harbor Hill's footprint if you know how to read the terrain. The shape of the hilltop, the way certain roads curl around it, the occasional old tree that is too large, too perfectly placed, to be random landscaping from the 1950s. These traces are subtle, easy to overlook. Most residents have no idea. They go to work, mow their lawns, take out the trash, all while living above foundations they do not know are there. The history sits underneath everyday life, layered into the dirt, waiting for somebody to get curious. Usually that curiosity is metaphorical, rather than someone literally grabbing a shovel. Though sometimes it is literal too. A homeowner digging for a new patio or basement addition hits stone where none should be. They uncover a section of wall, a flight of buried steps, an old footing. They stare at it, confused, and ask why anyone would have buried so much good masonry. In many cases, they never get a full answer. Increasingly, though, people do go looking for that answer. They research their addresses. They pull old maps and aerial photos. They discover that their modest house sits where a ballroom once stood, or where a formal garden stretched downhill. They find photographs of a mansion that used to tower over the same patch of earth. That discovery rewires how they see their own home. The small house does not change, but the story around it does. It is no longer just a place in the suburbs. It is a point on a longer timeline, connected to fortunes, parties, crashes, and demolitions. The knowledge spreads neighbor to neighbor. One person shares what they found at a cookout or online. Someone else gets curious and checks their lot. Soon an entire street knows that they are driving on the old carriage route, that their cul-de-sac sits where the stables once were, that the big maple anchoring the block was part of an original alley. The vanished estate becomes a shared ghost story, except this one is real. That kind of awareness does not bring any building back. Physically, nothing changes. The houses are still gone. The foundations stay buried. But it changes how people read the landscape. Their suburb stops being generic. It becomes a place with a specific past, with layers of wealth and loss under the trimmed hedges and mailboxes. The past rarely disappears cleanly, it mostly sinks. It goes underground, both literally and in memory. But it does not fully leave. It waits in property maps, in odd street curves, in old trees and buried stone, ready to reappear for anyone willing to stop, look twice, and start digging into the story.